Watch closely, because in this exact moment, things start to get seriously uncomfortable. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? One where a simple question begins to reveal a deeper tension between perspective and experience. Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. The segment begins the way many daytime discussions do, with a calm and welcoming tone. The panel on The View is mid-conversation, transitioning into a topic that had been making headlines that week: representation in media and how actors approach their roles in an increasingly diverse industry. The hosts are seated comfortably, each offering their perspective in a familiar rhythm that longtime viewers would recognize immediately. As the conversation develops, the focus shifts toward the guest of the day, Brie Larson, who is seated across from the panel. She has already been part of a light exchange about her recent work, her preparation for roles, and the broader direction of Hollywood. Her tone up to this point has been measured, thoughtful, and consistent with how she typically presents herself in interviews. Engaged but careful with her words. The discussion takes a more specific turn when one of the hosts brings up comments Brie had made in previous interviews about inclusivity in film criticism and the importance of diverse voices in media conversations. The topic itself isn't new to daytime television, but it carries enough weight that it subtly shifts the energy in the room. Joy Behar leans forward slightly, signaling that she's about to engage more directly. Her expression is attentive but firm, the kind viewers often associate with her when she's preparing to challenge a point. She begins by acknowledging Brie's perspective, but frames a question around whether emphasizing certain voices over others risks excluding people who also have valid opinions. The tone is still polite, but there's a noticeable change in pacing. The pauses between sentences become slightly longer. Brie listens carefully, maintaining eye contact, her posture upright. She doesn't interrupt, allowing Joy to fully articulate her point, which touches on fairness and whether the idea of who gets to speak could be interpreted as limiting open discussion. When it's Brie's turn to respond, she does so calmly, choosing her words with precision. She clarifies that her previous comments were not about excluding anyone, but rather about expanding the conversation to include perspectives that have historically been underrepresented. Her voice remains steady, and she gestures lightly with her hands to emphasize certain points, a sign that she is fully engaged but not escalating emotionally. At this stage, the exchange still resembles a typical talk show debate, measured, respectful, and grounded in differing viewpoints. However, the underlying tension becomes more noticeable as Joy follows up with another question, this time more direct. She asks whether there's a risk that focusing too heavily on representation could unintentionally create division, rather than unity. The audience in the studio reacts subtly. There are a few scattered murmurs, the kind that suggest people are paying close attention and beginning to form their own opinions. It's not disruptive, but it adds a layer of atmosphere that can only really be felt in a live setting. Brie pauses briefly before answering again. It's a small moment, but it stands out. She appears to consider the framing of the question carefully before responding. When she speaks, her tone remains composed, but there's a slight shift. Her response carries a bit more emphasis now, as she explains that acknowledging different experiences doesn't divide people. Instead, it allows for a fuller understanding of the audience as a whole. She points out that the goal isn't to replace one voice with another, but to make space for more voices overall. As she explains this, her body language reflects a mix of confidence and restraint. Her hands move slightly more, but her posture remains controlled, signaling that she is engaged without becoming confrontational. Joy listens, but her expression suggests she's not entirely convinced. She nods occasionally, but her follow-up question comes quickly, almost before Brie has fully settled back into her seat. This time, Joy frames her response in a more conversational way, but the core of her question remains pointed. She asks whether audiences might feel alienated if they perceive that certain viewpoints are being prioritized. At this point, another host briefly interjects, attempting to broaden the discussion and keep the tone balanced. It's a common dynamic on panel shows like this, where multiple voices work to keep the conversation from becoming too narrowly focused or overly intense. The interjection provides a brief moment of relief, and there's a light comment that draws a small laugh from the audience. But the central tension doesn't fully dissipate. The conversation returns to Brie and Joy, and while both remain respectful, the difference in their perspectives is now clearly established. Brie reiterates her position, emphasizing that inclusion is about adding perspectives, not removing them. She speaks in a way that suggests she's aware of how her words might be interpreted, choosing clarity over brevity. Joy, in turn, acknowledges the point but raises a broader concern about how these ideas are communicated to the public. Her tone remains steady, but there's a firmness in her delivery that signals she's standing by her viewpoint. The audience's attention remains fixed. There are no large reactions yet, but the energy in the room feels more focused. It's the kind of moment that viewers at home might lean in for, not because it's dramatic, but because it feels real. Two people with different perspectives are engaging directly, without interruption or escalation, but with clear conviction. As the segment continues, the rhythm of the conversation slows slightly. Each response is more deliberate, each question more carefully framed. It's no longer just a casual discussion. It's a thoughtful exchange that requires both participants to fully articulate their positions. Brie maintains her composure, but there's a subtle increase in intensity in her voice, not in volume but in emphasis. She seems intent on making sure her point is understood clearly, without being misinterpreted. Joy, meanwhile, continues to listen and respond in kind, her questions reflecting a genuine attempt to challenge the idea rather than dismiss it. By the end of this portion of the segment, the groundwork for a deeper discussion has been firmly established. The tone remains respectful, but the contrast in viewpoints is now unmistakable. It's the kind of exchange that doesn't rely on raised voices or dramatic moments, but instead builds gradually through thoughtful disagreement. And as the camera briefly cuts to a wider shot of the panel, capturing the attentive expressions of the hosts and the focused silence of the audience, it becomes clear that this conversation is far from over. As the conversation continues, the tone in the studio remains composed, but there's a noticeable shift in how carefully each word is being chosen. What began as a general discussion about representation has now become more personal in its framing, not in a confrontational sense, but in the way both Brie Larson and Joy Behar are grounding their points in broader principles. Brie leans slightly forward again, signaling she wants to clarify something before the conversation moves too far ahead. She reiterates that her earlier comments, both on the show and in past interviews, were often taken out of context. Her tone remains even, but there's a quiet firmness underneath it now. She explains that when she talks about inclusion, she's speaking from her own experiences within the industry, where she's observed patterns about whose voices are typically elevated and whose are often missing. The way she phrases it is careful and measured. She doesn't generalize broadly. Instead, she keeps bringing the focus back to the idea of balance. Her hands come up briefly again, palms slightly open, a gesture that suggests she's trying to explain rather than defend. It's a subtle distinction, but one that comes across clearly in her delivery. Joy listens, maintaining eye contact, but as Brie finishes, she shifts slightly in her seat and prepares to respond. There's a small pause before she speaks, and when she does, her tone remains conversational, but there's a sharper edge to her phrasing compared to earlier. She acknowledges Brie's intention, but questions whether the way these ideas are sometimes communicated publicly can come across as exclusionary, even if that isn't the intent. This is where the pacing of the exchange changes again. The responses are quicker now, though still controlled. Brie responds almost immediately, not interrupting, but clearly ready to address the point. She explains that public conversations about representation often become simplified in headlines or short clips, and that nuance can get lost. Her expression remains calm, but her focus is intense. She's clearly engaged in making sure her perspective is fully understood. The studio audience reacts again, this time with a slightly more audible murmur. It's not disruptive, but it reflects the fact that the conversation has reached a point where people are starting to interpret and evaluate what's being said in real time. Another co-host briefly steps in, attempting to reframe the discussion in a broader context. She brings up how media narratives can sometimes amplify disagreements that are actually more nuanced when heard in full. It's a moment that briefly diffuses the tension, and there's a small nod from Brie in acknowledgement. Joy, however, brings the conversation back with a follow-up that feels more direct than anything she's asked so far. She poses a hypothetical scenario, asking whether someone who doesn't fall into the groups Brie is advocating for might feel that their perspective is being devalued. Her tone isn't aggressive, but the question itself lands with more weight. Brie takes a slightly longer pause this time before responding. It's a noticeable shift. She looks down briefly, then back up, as if organizing her thoughts carefully. When she speaks, her voice remains steady, but there's a clearer sense of emphasis in how she structures her response. She explains that acknowledging inequality in representation isn't the same as dismissing other viewpoints. She points out that in many industries, not just film, there's a long history of certain voices dominating conversations, often unintentionally. Her argument is that creating space for others doesn't diminish anyone else's voice. It simply broadens the conversation. As she speaks, her tone carries a bit more conviction than before. It's still calm, still controlled, but there's less hesitation. She's no longer just clarifying. She's firmly stating her position. Joy listens without interrupting, but her expression remains thoughtful and slightly skeptical. When Brie finishes, there's a brief silence. One of those moments on live television where no one speaks for just a second longer than usual. It's subtle, but it adds weight to the exchange. Then Joy responds again, this time taking a slightly different approach. Instead of directly challenging Brie's point, she frames her response around audience perception. She mentions that viewers at home may interpret these discussions differently depending on their own experiences, and that communication plays a big role in how messages are received. It's a nuanced point, and for a moment, the conversation feels like it might shift toward common ground. Brie nods slightly as Joy speaks, acknowledging the idea. But when she responds, she gently pushes back again, not dismissing the point, but adding to it. She agrees that communication matters, but emphasizes that discomfort in conversations about representation isn't necessarily a sign that something is wrong. Sometimes, she explains, it's a sign that people are being asked to consider perspectives they may not have encountered before. The way she says it is calm, but there's a clarity in her tone that stands out. She's no longer just explaining her perspective. She's articulating a broader principle. At this point, the audience reacts a bit more noticeably. There's a mix of light applause and murmured agreement, though it's not overwhelming. It's the kind of reaction that reflects engagement rather than strong division. The camera briefly cuts to other hosts at the table. One of them nods in agreement with parts of what Brie is saying, while another appears to be considering Joy's point more closely. It's a reminder that even within the panel, there isn't a single unified perspective. The conversation continues, and the rhythm settles into a pattern. Joy raises a concern. Brie responds with clarification and expansion, and occasionally another host steps in to add context or redirect slightly. It's a dynamic that feels authentic to live daytime television, where discussions are rarely linear and often evolve in real time. However, what stands out most in this portion of the exchange is how both participants maintain composure despite the growing intensity of the topic. There are no raised voices, no interruptions that cross into disrespect. Instead, the tension exists in the ideas themselves, the difference in how each person interprets the same issue. As the segment moves forward, Brie makes another point that subtly shifts the conversation. She talks about the responsibility that comes with having a platform, explaining that when someone is given the opportunity to speak publicly, there's a chance to either reinforce existing narratives or expand them. She's careful not to frame this as a criticism of anyone specifically. Instead, she presents it as a general observation, one that applies across industries and roles. Her tone softens slightly as she says this, perhaps to ensure the point doesn't come across as confrontational. Joy responds with a small nod, acknowledging the idea, but then adds that responsibility can also mean making sure all audiences feel included in the conversation. It's a subtle pivot, but it keeps the discussion balanced between the two perspectives. At this stage, the exchange has reached a level of depth that goes beyond a typical talk show segment. It's no longer just about a single comment or viewpoint. It's about how broader ideas are communicated and understood. The audience remains attentive, and the energy in the room is steady but focused. There's a sense that everyone is aware this is a meaningful discussion, even if it's unfolding in a calm and controlled way. As the camera returns to a closer shot of Brie, she prepares to respond again, her expression thoughtful and composed. And just before she begins to speak, there's a brief pause in the conversation, a moment that feels like a natural transition point, as if the discussion is about to move into an even more reflective phase. The brief pause gives the conversation a moment to reset, but it doesn't reduce the weight of what's been said. If anything, it allows both Brie Larson and Joy Behar to move into a more reflective part of the exchange, where the focus shifts slightly from defining positions to examining how those positions are understood in practice. Brie resumes speaking with a calm, deliberate tone. She acknowledges that conversations like this can feel complicated, especially on live television where time is limited and ideas have to be expressed quickly. She explains that when she talks about inclusion, she's often thinking about long-term change, how industries evolve over time rather than how individual conversations are perceived in the moment. Her voice remains steady, but there's a noticeable clarity in how she structures her thoughts now. She speaks a bit more slowly, as if she's intentionally pacing herself to avoid being misunderstood. Her hands move less than before, resting lightly in front of her, signaling a shift from emphasis to reflection. Joy listens closely, her posture upright, her expression attentive. When Brie finishes, Joy takes a moment before responding. It's not a long pause, but it's enough to show that she's considering how to frame her next point. When she speaks, her tone is still measured, but there's a renewed focus in her words. She brings the conversation back to the audience perspective once again, but this time with a slightly different angle. She suggests that while long-term change is important, the way ideas are introduced matters just as much, especially in a public forum. Her point is that people don't always have the full context behind statements, and that can lead to confusion or even resistance. The exchange remains respectful, but the tension now lies in how each person prioritizes different aspects of the issue. Brie is emphasizing intent and long-term impact, while Joy is focusing on perception and immediate understanding. At this point, another co-host steps in more noticeably than before, attempting to bridge the gap between the two perspectives. She points out that both ideas can exist at the same time, that it's possible to push for broader inclusion while also being mindful of how those messages are received by different audiences. This interjection introduces a moment of balance, and both Brie and Joy acknowledge it with small nods. The audience responds with light applause, appreciating the attempt to bring the discussion toward common ground. But the conversation doesn't fully settle there. Brie responds to the point by agreeing that communication is important, but she adds that sometimes conversations about change are inherently uncomfortable. Her tone remains calm, but there's a quiet emphasis in her words that wasn't as pronounced earlier. She explains that discomfort can be part of growth, and that avoiding difficult conversations for the sake of comfort doesn't necessarily lead to meaningful progress. It's a statement that lands with a certain weight, not because it's confrontational, but because it's direct. The audience reacts again, this time with a slightly stronger response. There's a mix of applause and murmured agreement, though it's still controlled and appropriate for the setting. The reaction doesn't disrupt the conversation, but it adds to the sense that the discussion has reached a more impactful point. Joy listens carefully, her expression thoughtful. When she responds, her tone softens slightly, and she acknowledges that growth often involves discomfort. However, she gently pushes back on the idea that discomfort should be expected or normalized in every context. She suggests that there's value in finding ways to have these conversations that bring people in rather than risk pushing them away. It's a subtle distinction, but an important one. And it keeps the exchange grounded in differing approaches rather than opposing beliefs. The camera briefly cuts to a wider shot of the panel on the view, capturing the dynamic between the hosts. One of them appears to be listening intently, leaning slightly forward, while another maintains a more neutral posture, observing the exchange without immediately stepping in. As the camera returns to Brie, she takes another moment before responding. This pause is slightly longer than the others, and it feels intentional. She looks toward Joy as she speaks, maintaining steady eye contact. She clarifies that her intention has never been to make anyone feel excluded or dismissed. Instead, she emphasizes that her focus has always been on expanding opportunities and ensuring that a wider range of perspectives can be heard. Her tone softens slightly as she says this, perhaps to underscore that her position is rooted in inclusion rather than opposition. At the same time, she doesn't step away from her earlier point. She reiterates that change often requires conversations that challenge existing norms, even if those conversations are uncomfortable at times. Joy nods as she listens, and when she responds, her tone reflects a bit more openness than before. She acknowledges that Brie's explanation provides helpful context, and she agrees that expanding perspectives is important. However, she maintains that the way these ideas are communicated publicly can shape how they're received, sometimes in ways that aren't intended. This back and forth continues, but the tone begins to shift slightly. While the disagreement is still present, there's a growing sense of mutual understanding. Both participants are no longer just defending their positions. They're also recognizing the validity in parts of the other's perspective. The audience seems to pick up on this shift as well. The reactions become a bit more positive, with occasional light applause when points of agreement are acknowledged. Another host steps in again, this time summarizing part of the discussion. She notes that what they're really talking about is the balance between intent and impact, how something is meant versus how it's received. It's a concise way of framing the conversation, and it helps to bring some clarity to the exchange. Brie nods in agreement with that framing, and Joy does as well. For a brief moment, the conversation feels aligned. But even within that alignment, the nuances remain. Brie adds that while impact is important, it's also necessary to consider the systems that shape those impacts. She explains that individual reactions are influenced by broader contexts, and that addressing those contexts requires ongoing effort. Her tone remains calm, but there's a depth to her explanation that reflects how seriously she takes the topic. It's not just a surface-level discussion for her. It's something she's clearly thought about extensively. Joy listens, then responds by bringing the conversation back to the everyday viewer. She points out that many people watching at home may not be thinking about systemic contexts in the same way, and that messages need to resonate on a more immediate level as well. This exchange highlights the core difference in their perspectives. Brie is focused on systemic change and long-term progress, while Joy is emphasizing accessibility and immediate understanding. As the segment continues, the pacing slows slightly again. The initial tension has evolved into a more thoughtful dialogue, where each response builds on the previous one rather than directly challenging it. The audience remains engaged, and the atmosphere in the studio feels steady. There's no sense of conflict in the traditional sense, no raised voices or interruptions. But there is a clear and meaningful disagreement that's being explored in real time. As the camera settles once more on both Brie and Joy in a shared frame, capturing their attentive expressions and composed posture, it becomes clear that the conversation is moving toward a more reflective conclusion. But there's still more to be said, and the discussion continues with the same careful balance of conviction and respect that has defined it so far. As the discussion continues, there's a noticeable shift in energy, not a drop in intensity, but a refinement of it. What began as a careful exchange of perspectives is now settling into something more measured, where both Brie Larson and Joy Behar seem less focused on challenging each other directly and more focused on clarifying what they want the audience to take away. Brie leans back slightly in her chair, her posture more relaxed than before, but her expression remains attentive. When she speaks again, her tone is softer, though still deliberate. She acknowledges that conversations like this can easily become polarized outside of a setting like this, where people only hear fragments rather than the full exchange. She explains that one of the challenges she often encounters is how quickly nuanced discussions are reduced to short clips or headlines. In those moments, she says, the intention behind her words can be lost, leaving only a simplified version that doesn't fully represent what she was trying to communicate. As she speaks, her delivery is calm and reflective, almost as if she's stepping back from the disagreement itself to talk about the broader environment in which these conversations exist. It's a subtle but important shift, and it changes the tone of the exchange. Joy listens without interrupting, her expression thoughtful. When Brie finishes, Joy responds in a way that mirrors that same reflective tone. She agrees that media framing can sometimes oversimplify complex ideas, and she acknowledges that public figures often have limited control over how their words are presented once they're out in the world. This moment of agreement stands out. It doesn't resolve the earlier disagreement, but it creates a sense of shared understanding, at least in terms of the challenges both sides recognize. The audience reacts with light applause, picking up on this shift. It's not a loud reaction, but it signals appreciation for the more balanced tone that's emerging. However, the conversation doesn't end there. Joy gently pivots back to her earlier concern, but this time her approach is less direct, more conversational. She mentions that while context is important, there's still a responsibility to communicate ideas in a way that resonates clearly with a wide audience. Her tone is calm, but there's still a quiet firmness in her words. She's not backing away from her perspective. She's just expressing it in a way that aligns more closely with the tone Brie has just set. Brie nods as she listens, and when she responds, there's a sense that she's meeting Joy in that same space. She agrees that clarity is important, but she adds that clarity doesn't always mean simplicity. Some ideas, she explains, require a level of depth that can't always be captured in a single sentence or soundbite. Her voice remains steady, but there's a thoughtful emphasis in how she phrases this. It's less about defending her earlier statements and more about explaining the complexity behind them. At this point, another host on The View steps in again, this time with a slightly more active role in guiding the conversation. She summarizes what's been discussed so far, highlighting both the importance of inclusion and the importance of communication. Her tone is neutral, aiming to keep the discussion grounded and accessible for viewers. She then poses a broader question to both Brie and Joy, asking how public figures can balance advocating for change while also ensuring their message connects with as many people as possible. It's a question that shifts the focus from disagreement to problem solving, and both participants respond accordingly. Brie answers first. She explains that for her, it comes down to consistency and intention. She says that while she can't control how every message is received, she can control how she approaches conversations, by being clear about her goals and staying open to dialogue, even when it's challenging. Her tone is calm and sincere, and there's a sense that she's speaking not just to the hosts, but to the audience watching at home. She emphasizes that conversations like this are part of a larger process, one that requires patience and a willingness to listen as much as speak. Joy responds next, building on that idea. She agrees that dialogue is important, and she adds that part of effective communication is anticipating how different audiences might interpret a message. Her perspective remains consistent with what she's been saying throughout the segment, but her delivery now feels more collaborative than before. The dynamic between them has clearly evolved. The earlier tension hasn't disappeared entirely, but it's been replaced by a more constructive exchange. The audience's reaction reflects this shift. There are occasional nods, light applause, and a general sense of engagement rather than tension. It feels less like a debate and more like a discussion that's gradually finding common ground. As the segment approaches its later moments, the pacing slows even further. The hosts begin to wrap up the conversation, but not abruptly. Instead, they allow space for final thoughts, giving both Brie and Joy the opportunity to summarize their perspectives. Brie speaks first. She reiterates that her focus has always been on expanding opportunities and creating space for more voices to be heard. She acknowledges that these conversations can be complex and sometimes misunderstood, but she emphasizes the importance of continuing them anyway. Her tone is steady and reflective, and there's a sense of closure in how she presents her thoughts. She's no longer responding to specific questions. She's offering a broader takeaway. Joy follows with her own concluding remarks. She acknowledges the importance of inclusion and agrees that expanding perspectives is valuable. At the same time, she reiterates her belief that communication plays a crucial role in how those ideas are received. Her tone is calm and respectful, and like Brie, she seems focused on leaving the audience with something to consider rather than continuing the back and forth. The camera briefly cuts to a wide shot of the table, capturing all the hosts and Brie together. The atmosphere is composed, the earlier tension now softened into something more reflective. There's a brief exchange of smiles, not overly warm or exaggerated, but enough to signal mutual respect. It's a small moment, but it stands out after the depth of the conversation that's just taken place. As the segment begins to transition toward its close, the audience offers a final round of polite applause. It's steady and appreciative, reflecting the fact that while the discussion may not have resolved every difference, it was handled in a way that felt thoughtful and genuine. And as the camera lingers for just a moment longer, capturing the composed expressions of both Brie and Joy, it becomes clear that the conversation has moved beyond disagreement into something more measured. An exchange that, while not entirely aligned, has reached a point of understanding. As the segment moves into its final moments, the transition feels natural rather than abrupt. The discussion has gradually shifted from a point of tension into a more reflective space, and now the focus turns toward closing the conversation in a way that feels complete for both the in-studio audience and those watching at home. One of the co-hosts offers a brief wrap-up, thanking Brie Larson for joining the panel and for engaging so openly in a conversation that, while complex, remained grounded throughout. The tone at the table is calm, and there's a shared sense that the discussion has been meaningful, even if it didn't result in total agreement. Brie responds with a polite smile and a short acknowledgement. Her posture is relaxed now, her hands resting comfortably, a contrast to the more expressive gestures earlier in the segment. She thanks the hosts for the opportunity to talk through the topic in a more complete way, noting that conversations like this are important precisely because they allow for different perspectives to be heard in full. The camera briefly cuts to Joy Behar, who nods in agreement. Her expression is composed, and while she hasn't stepped away from her earlier points, there's a visible sense of mutual respect in how she acknowledges Brie's presence and participation. It's the kind of closing moment that reflects the tone of many discussions on The View: direct, occasionally tense, but ultimately respectful. As the conversation formally ends, the audience responds with a round of applause that feels steady and appreciative rather than overly enthusiastic. It's the kind of reaction that suggests viewers were engaged and attentive, even if they may have held differing opinions about what was said. The show transitions to the next segment, but the energy from the discussion lingers. In a live broadcast setting, moments like this don't simply disappear, they carry forward, both in the room and beyond it. For viewers watching at home, the exchange quickly becomes a topic of conversation. Clips begin to circulate shortly after the broadcast, particularly the moments where the discussion reached its most thoughtful points. Short excerpts of Brie explaining her perspective on inclusion, as well as Joy's questions about audience perception, are shared across social media platforms. What stands out in these clips is not confrontation, but contrast. Different viewers interpret the exchange in different ways. Some focus on Brie's emphasis on expanding perspectives, appreciating the clarity and calmness in how she expressed her views. Others highlight Joy's role in asking questions that reflect how audiences might receive those ideas, seeing her approach as a way of grounding the conversation in everyday experience. Online discussions begin to reflect this same balance. Rather than dividing sharply into opposing sides, many viewers comment on the tone of the conversation itself, how both participants maintained composure, how neither raised their voice, and how the discussion evolved without becoming unproductive. There are, of course, differing opinions. Some viewers feel that Brie's points could have been communicated more simply, echoing the concerns Joy raised during the segment. Others feel that the depth of Brie's explanation was necessary, and that reducing the conversation would have taken away from its meaning. Media outlets that cover daytime television also pick up on the segment, summarizing the exchange in articles that focus on the key themes rather than framing it as a conflict. The discussion is often described as a measured debate or a thoughtful exchange, emphasizing the way it unfolded rather than exaggerating its intensity. In follow-up interviews and discussions, the topic of representation in media continues to be explored, sometimes referencing the segment as an example of how these conversations can take place in a public forum. While neither Brie nor Joy dramatically revisits the exchange in a confrontational way, both perspectives remain part of the broader conversation. Back in the studio, as the show continues, there's a sense that the panel has moved on, but not without acknowledging what just took place. The hosts maintain their usual rhythm, transitioning into lighter topics or new segments, but the earlier discussion remains part of the day's overall narrative. For those who watch the segment live, the takeaway isn't a single definitive answer, but rather an example of how complex topics can be discussed openly. The moment didn't rely on dramatic escalation or sharp conflict. Instead, it held attention through steady, thoughtful dialogue. As the episode concludes and viewers reflect on what they've seen, the conversation between Brie Larson and Joy Behar stands out as one of those segments that invites continued thought rather than immediate judgment. It's the kind of exchange that stays with an audience, not because it was loud or sensational, but because it felt real. And as always with discussions like this, the most important part often comes afterward, when viewers take what they've heard and consider it in their own context, forming their own perspectives based on the ideas that were shared. If you watched this moment unfold, what stood out to you the most? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.